Can you hear me? Okay, so first of all, thank you for staying till the end of the day. I hope you are still energized, not so tired and sleepy. And I'll try to keep the talks short, and so that you can have dinner soon. So my topic is the problem of Genesis in Derrida and Daoism. And actually, I was surprised when I know that I am arranged to this panel, because it seems that all of you are studying the theoretical part of intercultural philosophy, but my paper seems to be a case study. So if your interest is more preferring the theoretical or methodological part of intercultural philosophy, I hope you can treat my presentation as an example of two cultural coming into conflict or contradictions. So when we talk about intercultural philosophy nowadays, we usually focus on communication, understanding, mutual understanding, or even harmony and peace. But in fact, if we dig into the deep epistemological basis of different cultures, we may find that perhaps different cultures will have different understanding of the world, which are contradictory to each other. So today, I will focus on the problem of Genesis, in which I think Derrida and Daoism comes to some disagreement. So let me start with this concept, Dao, which is one of the most difficult concepts that can even not be translated. So if we study Taoism nowadays, we usually keep the term Dao without any translation. So what is Dao? This is a very difficult problem for intercultural philosophy, especially when the Western world tries to understand the Chinese culture. And here I cannot discuss all characters of Dao, but I just pick up one important character of Dao, in which Theodogen says, Dao gives birth to the one gives birth to two gives birth to three gives birth to the 10,000 things. So from this quotation, it seems that Dao is the genesis of all things in the world. It is the origin of all beings in the universe. So this is the literal understanding of the sentence. But when we come to Derrida, we find that this idea of Genesis is indeed problematic, because Derrida says Genesis, when it is examined naively and in the most formal way possible, brings together two contradicting meanings in this concept. One of origin, one of becoming. So what Derrida proposed here is that the concept of Genesis itself is perhaps problematic. Or in other words, is there possible to have a beginning of something, or the beginning of time? And in fact, when we go back to Aristotle and Kant, they all discover that the concept of this beginning of being, or this beginning of time, is problematic. Because, as Derrida continues, Genesis cannot be reduced to the preceding instance, radicalness, creation, autonomy in relation to something other than itself, because it is already the absolute beginning. So it cannot be related to other things. It cannot be preceded by other things. But on the other hand, there is no Genesis except within a temporal and ontological totality which encloses it. That means if this origin is in fact an origin, then it should be at least causally related to the genetic process that it creates, right? But in this sense, it is already contaminated with the temporal event. So it is not the pure absolute origin as such. So Derrida proposed that Genesis is a contradictory concept as it exists within and beyond time. So if Derrida's judgment of the concept of Genesis is correct, it will constitute a direct challenge to the quote of Theodogen, because the Theodogen exactly claims that Dao is like an origin which creates the 10,000 things. So my paper aims at solving this problem and see how the two traditions can come into dialogue. And in fact, we have to say that this challenge by Derrida is not completely external to the Chinese tradition. In fact, in the Zhangzi, in the chapter 2 of Zhangzi, the Qi Lun, he already says that if there is a beginning, there is a not yet beginning to be a beginning. There is a not yet beginning to be a not yet beginning to be a beginning. So similarly, if there is being, there is non-being. And there is a not yet beginning to be non-being. And there is a not yet beginning to be a not yet beginning to be non-being. And suddenly, there is being and non-being. But between this being and non-being, I don't really know which is being and which is non-being. So in fact, in the Taoist tradition, at least Zhuangzi already discovered this problem of having this ideal or pure concept of origin, or the absolute beginning of time and being. So if we regard Taoism as a consistent intellectual tradition, then we should have a way to solve this problem. Otherwise, we can only accept that Zhuangzi and the Theodogen is holding a contradictory view. And in order to deal with this problem, I first of all classified two concepts of origin. The first concept of origin is what I call the absolute origin. So the origin means the ultimate origin of all things. So this sense of origin is used in cosmogony, physics, or metaphysics. So in a logical form, it's like this. So there exists some y. For all x, if this x is a thing, then this y is the origin of this thing. So that is one and only one origin of all things in the universe. And the second sense of origin is what I call the Theodogen meaning of origin, or the natural meaning of origin. That is the origin of a particular event or entity. So this concept of origin is found in history of biology. So for example, when we try to find out the origin of one species, this species is only the origin of this species instead of others. Or we can talk about the origin of one historical event. So for everything and every event in the universe, we can trace back to the origin, but we cannot say that there is one origin that is the origin of all things and events. And I will follow these two concepts of origin and to explore how the contradiction can be solved. And in short, I will claim that Derrida's criticism of the concept of origin can just apply to the concept of absolute origin. And for Theodogen or Taoist philosophy, they can develop a philosophy of genesis based on the second notion of origin. So let me start with the first one. So according to Derrida, the critique of origin or genesis is heading to the so-called metaphysics of presence. So according to Derrida, there is a long tradition in Western philosophy that the present now point is privileged among the three time phases. And there is an absolute origin that can be recovered from what is present here and now. And one example of this metaphysics of presence may be the Aristotle idea of time. So Aristotle's idea of time is that time is a timeline constituted by infinitely many present now points. And each now point is in essence the same. So time is actually the eternal repetition of the same present now point. So from the present now point here and now, we can trace back, ideally speaking, to the absolute origin of time and the cause of being. But what Derrida in his dissertation is Husserl's idea of transcendental ego. So in Derrida's work, The Problem of Genesis, in Husserl's philosophy, he attacks Husserl's idea of transcendental ego as committing the problem of the metaphysics of presence. And the evidence can be found in Husserl's ideas 1, where he claims that in doing phenomenology or philosophy, we have to stick to the principle of all principles. That is, that every originally presented intuition is a legitimizing source of cognition. So, briefly speaking, according to the principle of phenomenology, everything that we can understand and experience is understood through the presentive intuition here and now. I can either experience this thing through sensation, perception, or categorical intuition. So the first person experience here and now can encompass every possible objects of science and philosophy. And the second principle that Husserl proposed in the Ideas 1 is that the transcendental ego is the center of all intentionalities. That is, the experiencing ego itself is the center of all possible experience, from which I can discover all possible objects and essence through reflection and retrospection. And in this process of reflection, it requires time or internal time consciousness as the fundamental constitution of our subjectivity, so that I can reproduce my experience and to objectify objects through identification, memories, and perception, etc. But this idea of transcendental ego exactly falls into the metaphysics of presence, because from the principle of all principle, we find that the presentive intuition, that is the eternal present now point, is privileged in Husserl's phenomenology. And the absolute origin can be recovered from the past, from the present here and now. It's reflected in Husserl's idea of internal time consciousness. So according to Husserl's theory, the past is only a correlate of the retention of our time consciousness. So in other words, the whole time flow is encompassed by our internal time consciousness. So Husserl's theory is exactly a model of the metaphysics of presence. And in Derrida's dissertation, he finds that Husserl's theory is recurring to the problem of self-consciousness. That is, how can this transcendental ego as the origin of consciousness can be retrieved phenomenologically. So he finds that Husserl phenomenology has trouble in describing the relation between the psychological and the transcendental, the constituting and the constituted, the ego and the life lived by the ego. That is, how can this transcendental ego standing at the present now point can understand the whole temporal and historical life of this transcendental ego. So according to Derrida, this difficulty faced by Husserl is in fact a modified form of the paradox of Genesis, because we have said that the problem of Genesis is constituted by that it is both within and beyond time. And the difficulty that Husserl is facing here is the same problem. The transcendental ego is both within and beyond time. So through identifying the paradox of Genesis, Derrida wished to deconstruct Husserl's phenomenology. And Derrida's thesis is that the origin cannot be separated from the process of being, but is already engaged in the process through temporality. So Derrida wished to replace the idea of absolute origin with this concept of contamination. And here we find that this idea of contamination is quite similar to what the Theodogen says in the chapter 1, in which it says 有 or being or existence of something and 无 non-being or nothing appear together but receive different names. In Chinese, 同桌而异名. So if we stick to the chapter 1 of the Theodogen, we will find that according to the philosophy of the Theodogen, the so-called origin or Tao is not that pure and absolute, but it is already a contamination of 有 and 无. So this gives us a clue to answer to Derrida's critique if we can explore the real meaning of this contamination between being and non-being. So let me start the second part, that is how the Theodogen formulates its philosophy of Genesis. So from the chapter 1 of the Theodogen, it already hints that the contamination or the interplay between existence and nothingness, being and non-being, is this concept 玄 or the 玄门, the gateway, or the mysterious gateway. So, for example, in chapter 1 it says 有 and 无 appear together but receive different names. They are called the mystery, where the mystery is the deepest, is the gateway. And all that is subtle and wonderful comes from this interplay of the gateway. And we can find a similar quote from the Zhuangzi, which says, there is life, there is death, there is a coming out, there is a going back. Yet in the coming out and going back, its form is never seen. This is called the heavenly gate, Tianmen. So we see that in both Zhuangzi and Theodogen, this concept of gateway is the interplay or the in-betweenness of 有 and 无, being and nothingness. And the problem is, how can we understand this interplay or this idea of gateway? So in order to interpret this idea, I first explore the meaning of 无. So according to many Taoist scholars, 无 can have two meanings. One is nothingness, and other is space. Some scholars believe that, for example, in chapter 1 of the Theodogen, 无 is understood as nothingness, as the opposite side of 有. And in this chapter, 无 is understood as a space. For example, it says, the 30 spokes shared one hop, adapt the nothing therein to the purpose in hand, you will have the use of the cart. This play in order to make a vessel. Adapt the nothingness therein to the purpose in hand, and you will have the use of the vessel. So in this passage, 无 is understood as the space in which we can make use of something. And adopting this idea, I think that 无 is first of all known as a space in which time can occur. And this idea is found in an excavated text, Heng Xian, which says space, 的欲, arises. Once there is space, there is qi. Once there is qi, there is material existence. When there is material existence, there is a beginning. Once there is a beginning, there is the passage of time. So from this quotation, we can see that according to the Beijing Daoism, space in fact comes before the passage of time. And in fact, we can find a pair of notions, 宇宙 and 时 in Zhuangzi, which share the same meaning. So I think that if we understand this 无 as an empty space of the occurrence of time, then we can interpret the genesis of a particular thing and events as something coming from non-existence to existence and then disappear again, or an event from not yet happening to happening to the end. So the space of the passage of time is where time, the passage of time can occur. So here I distinguish two models of time here. So for Derrida as well as the Western philosophy, they adopt the chronicle idea of time. So time appears as a timeline. It moves from 0, 1, 2, and 3, and for each moment we always stand at a single point, and the origin is always past. So from this unidirectional timeline, when we stand at time 3, we can never go back to 0. So the problem of origin or genesis become a problem. But when we interpret time as a space, then the Taurus model of time is like this. So what is 0? For example, the World Congress of Philosophy is this space for me to deliver this talk here. So the time of my talk is situated within this time of the Congress of Philosophy. So it happens, the Congress of Philosophy appears as a time for the occurrence of my talk. So at this moment when I start talking, my talk appears from nothingness to being. And when I finish talking, my talk will return to nothingness. And every event and things in the universe occurs in that way. And in this sense, we can talk about something coming from nothingness to being, and then return from being to nothingness. And this space of time, and ultimate stance is Tao. That is the origin of the occurrence of all things and events in the universe. And in this diagram, we can explain how a thing can return to its origin at the end of its course of being. So in summary, each gateway makes a moment in time which distinguishes what has just passed, what is now revealed, and what will show forth. This gateway is therefore the edge of temporalization of time. So through this gateway, we can explain how Daoism can talk about the idea of genesis. And the conclusion is that the Theodogen can resolve Derrida's paradox of genesis because it has a different concept of time, which does not regard change as a chronicle process, but a process in which times come to be and return to nothingness. The origin of things can therefore be recovered when they return to a larger background of their occurrence. And I hope this presentation as a case study will show how different traditions, when they first appear as a contradiction, can come to a common ground on which they can come to dialogue. In this case, the idea of Genesis and Tao at the beginning appear to be two contradictory terms, but at the final stage of our investigation, we find that actually the point of disagreement is on the concept of time. So this will become a new level for us to study or compare the philosophy of Taoism and Derrida, as well as many other kinds of philosophy. So thank you for your patience.